My husband looked into my eyes, squeezed my hand across our kitchen table, and promised he would never miss our anniversary again. Those were the last words I believed without question. 43 years of marriage had taught me that love wasn't measured by expensive gifts or grand vacations. It lived in ordinary mornings, fresh coffee shared before sunrise, handwritten grocery lists, and quiet conversations on the back porch while the neighborhood settled into the evening. My name is Helen Carter, and at 66 years old, I thought I knew everything there was to know about the man I had spent most of my life loving. Our anniversary fell on a warm Friday in early September. The weather forecast promised clear skies and temperatures in the mid-70s, perfect for the dinner reservation Michael had insisted on making weeks earlier. He had smiled when he booked the little restaurant overlooking the river, joking that after all these years he still wanted an excuse to wear the navy blazer I had given him for his retirement party. I laughed, pretending to roll my eyes, but secretly I loved hearing him talk that way. There had been anniversaries he missed before. One because of a business trip. Another because his father had been hospitalized. Once because a snowstorm shut down every road in 3 counties. Each time there had been a reason, and each time I accepted it because that is what marriage often asks of 2 imperfect people. But 6 months earlier, after forgetting our anniversary completely, Michael had wrapped his arms around me in our kitchen and whispered, "I promise you, Helen, never again." I held on to those words longer than I should have. I spent the entire day preparing for the evening as if we were newlyweds instead of grandparents. I had my silver hair styled at the salon downtown. I wore the emerald green dress Michael always said brought out my eyes. Around my neck rested the small gold necklace he bought me on our 10th anniversary, the one I rarely wore because it always felt too special for ordinary days. I even stopped by the bakery to pick up a small lemon cake, our favorite, because I thought it would be nice to celebrate again after dinner when we came home. Every detail felt important. Every little tradition reminded me that some promises deserved to be believed. Michael left the house shortly after lunch. He kissed my forehead, smiled, and said he only had one quick errand before meeting me at the restaurant at 6 o'clock sharp. "Don't be late," I teased as he picked up his car keys. He laughed. "Not this time." Those words echoed in my mind all afternoon. At 5:45, I arrived at the restaurant a few minutes early. The hostess led me to a table beside the windows where the river reflected the orange glow of the setting sun. Couples around me laughed softly over glasses of wine, while a pianist played familiar classics in the corner. I checked my watch. 6 o'clock came and went. I smiled politely whenever the hostess glanced toward the entrance, silently assuring her my husband would arrive any minute. By 6:15 my coffee had grown cold. At 6:30 I called Michael's cell phone. It rang until voicemail answered with his calm, familiar voice. I left a short message trying to sound cheerful. By 7 o'clock, the restaurant had filled with conversations, clinking silverware, and anniversary toasts that somehow made my own table feel even quieter. I paid for the untouched dinner, thanked the embarrassed waitress for her kindness, and walked into the cooling evening air. As I drove home beneath the fading light, I noticed something that made my hands tighten around the steering wheel. Parked 3 blocks from our neighborhood, in front of a modest white house I had never seen before, sat Michael's blue sedan. The porch light glowed softly. A woman's silhouette appeared behind the front window, and in that silent moment, every promise my husband had ever made suddenly felt as fragile as glass. I did not pull over. I kept driving until I reached our driveway, parked inside the garage, and sat with both hands resting on the steering wheel, while the engine ticked quietly as it cooled. For several long minutes I simply stared ahead. Part of me wanted to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Perhaps Michael had stopped to help an old friend. Perhaps that house belonged to a coworker or a distant cousin I had forgotten about. After 43 years together, surely there had to be a reasonable explanation. That was the story I repeated to myself as I walked into our silent home, hung my purse on its usual hook, and carefully placed the untouched lemon cake into the refrigerator. The frosting still looked perfect. It seemed almost unfair that something could remain so beautiful, while my thoughts became more tangled by the minute. I changed out of my dress, folded it neatly across the foot of the bed, and sat beside the bedroom window. Every passing set of headlights made me glance toward the driveway. Every distant engine sounded as though it might belong to Michael. 9 o'clock came, then 10, His phone continued to send me straight to voicemail. I did not call again. Instead, I wandered through the house, noticing little things that had once felt ordinary. His favorite coffee mug was still sitting beside the sink from breakfast. His reading glasses rested on the living room end table next to the mystery novel he had promised to finish weeks ago. The television remote remained exactly where he always left it. Everything looked normal, yet nothing felt familiar anymore. As midnight approached, memories I had ignored for months quietly returned. Michael had begun working later than usual almost a year earlier. At first, I believed him when he explained that retirement had turned into part-time consulting because the company needed his experience. Then came the weekend errands that always seemed to take longer than expected. There were business lunches that stretched into late afternoons and evening meetings that somehow appeared on our calendar without warning. None of those moments had seemed important by themselves. Marriage teaches you not to count every minute your spouse spends away from home. Trust grows from giving each other room to breathe. But sitting alone in the darkness, each forgotten detail suddenly fit beside another like pieces of a puzzle I had never intended to solve. I remembered finding a receipt from a florist in his jacket pocket even though no flowers had arrived at our house. I remembered how quickly he closed his laptop whenever I walked into the room. I remembered asking why he had started locking his phone after decades of leaving it on the kitchen counter without a second thought. Each answer had sounded reasonable at the time. Looking back, I realized I had accepted explanations because I wanted peace more than certainty. Shortly after 1 o'clock in the morning, I heard tires rolling slowly into the driveway. I stood behind the living room curtains without turning on a single light. Michael stepped out of the car, paused for a moment as though gathering himself, then walked toward the front door carrying nothing except his keys. His shoulders looked heavier than usual. He entered quietly, believing I was asleep. When he saw me standing in the dim light, surprise flashed across his face before disappearing behind a tired smile. He apologized for missing dinner and said an unexpected situation had kept him away. He spoke gently, carefully choosing each word, but he never explained where he had been. I simply nodded and told him I was glad he had made it home safely. He looked relieved that I had not asked any questions. A few minutes later, he disappeared into the bathroom while I remained in the hallway listening to the sound of running water. For the first time in our marriage, silence no longer felt comforting. It felt like a wall built one careful brick at a time. As I looked toward the window, I could still picture that modest white house glowing beneath its porch light, and deep inside I realized that whatever truth waited behind that front door had already begun changing my life before I even knew its name. The next morning I woke before sunrise. Although I could not remember falling asleep, Michael was already gone. A handwritten note rested beside the coffee maker in the kitchen. It said he had an early meeting and would be home before dinner. The words looked ordinary, but I found myself studying his handwriting as though it belonged to a stranger. I folded the note and slipped it into the drawer instead of throwing it away. Something inside me had changed overnight. I no longer wanted comforting explanations. I wanted the truth. I spent the morning following my usual routine. I watered the flowers on the front porch, folded a basket of laundry, and stopped at the grocery store for milk and fresh vegetables. Anyone watching would have seen an ordinary retired woman living an ordinary life. Inside, however, every passing hour carried a quiet question that refused to leave me alone. Shortly after lunch I found myself driving without a destination until I realized my car was heading toward the neighborhood where I had seen Michael's sedan the night before. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, but I kept going. The White House looked exactly the same in the afternoon sunlight. It was small but carefully maintained, with trimmed hedges, flower boxes beneath the windows, and a blue front door that had been freshly painted. There was nothing mysterious about it. It looked like the kind of home where friendly neighbors exchanged holiday cookies and waved from their driveways. I parked across the street where several other cars lined the curb and waited. I told myself I would leave after 5 minutes. 5 minutes became 20. Finally, the front door opened. A woman stepped onto the porch carrying a watering can. She appeared to be in her early 60s with neatly cut silver hair and a pale yellow cardigan despite the warm afternoon. She smiled at a golden retriever lying near the porch steps before carefully watering several hanging baskets filled with bright red flowers. She did not look like the person I had imagined during my sleepless night. She looked kind. She looked peaceful. She looked completely ordinary. A few minutes later, another familiar car slowly pulled into the driveway. Michael climbed out carrying a brown paper bag and a bouquet of white daisies. My heart sank so suddenly that I forgot to breathe. He smiled at the woman with a warmth I had not seen directed toward me in months. She smiled back and accepted the flowers before touching his arm with quiet gratitude. They stood talking on the porch for several moments. There was no dramatic confrontation. No raised voices. No secretive rush inside the house. Just two people sharing a conversation that I could not hear. Somehow that ordinary scene unsettled me even more than anything my imagination had invented. I remained exactly where I was. I could have walked across the street. I could have called his name. I could have demanded an explanation after 4 decades of marriage. Instead, I watched as Michael carried the grocery bag inside, while the woman held the door open for him. The door closed gently behind them, leaving only the quiet neighborhood and the sound of birds singing from nearby trees. I drove away without letting either of them know I had been there. On the drive home, I realized I was no longer searching for proof that my husband had lied. I already had that. The question that haunted me now was far more difficult. Who was the woman behind the blue door? And why had Michael decided that whatever connected them was worth sacrificing the promise he once told me he would never break again? For the next several days I said nothing. I smiled across the breakfast table, asked Michael whether he wanted more coffee, and listened as he described errands, meetings, and small inconveniences with the calm confidence of someone who believed his routine had not changed. I answered politely, but I also began paying attention in ways I never had before. Every receipt left in his pockets, every appointment written on the family calendar, every unexpected trip outside the house became another quiet detail that I tucked away without comment. I was not trying to catch him in a lie anymore. I was trying to understand the life he had somehow built alongside the one we shared. One afternoon while Michael was out, I sat at the dining room table with our monthly bank statements. We had always managed our finances together, so nothing about looking through them felt dishonest. At first, everything appeared ordinary. Utility bills, grocery purchases, charitable donations, and the occasional dinner out. Then I noticed several automatic payments made on the 15th of every month. They were always the same amount and were sent electronically to an account identified only by a long series of numbers. The payments stretched back almost 11 months. They were not large enough to threaten our savings, but they were significant enough that I knew I would have remembered approving them. I continued reading. There were purchases from a neighborhood pharmacy near the White House, a local grocery store I had never visited, and a medical supply company located across town. None of it made sense. If Michael had been spending money on another life, it was not the glamorous picture my fears had painted. There were no luxury hotels, expensive jewelry stores, or lavish vacations. Instead, I saw practical purchases that raised even more questions than they answered. Later that week, I drove through the same neighborhood once again. This time I parked farther away and walked slowly along the sidewalk carrying a reusable shopping bag, pretending I had business nearby. As I passed the White House, I noticed a small wheelchair ramp leading to the side entrance, carefully painted to match the porch. I was almost certain it had been hidden from my view before. Wind chimes moved gently in the afternoon breeze, while the golden retriever rested quietly beneath a maple tree. The woman stepped outside holding a stack of mail. She paused to help an elderly neighbor retrieve a package that had been left near the curb. They spoke for several minutes before exchanging warm smiles. I kept walking without looking back. Nothing about her behavior matched the image I had created during those sleepless nights. She did not seem secretive or manipulative. If anything, she appeared to be carrying her own quiet burdens with remarkable grace. That evening, Michael returned home later than expected. As he loosened his tie, I casually mentioned that I had spent part of my afternoon driving through neighborhoods we had once considered for retirement. His expression changed for only a heartbeat before returning to normal, but after 43 years I recognized the smallest shift in his eyes. He asked which neighborhoods I had visited. I listed several, saving the White House for last. He nodded a little too quickly and changed the subject by asking what I wanted for dinner. It was a smooth conversation, almost effortless, yet I walked away more convinced than ever that the truth was waiting just beyond the edge of everything he was willing to tell me. That night, while he slept peacefully beside me, I stared into the darkness and made a decision. The next time Michael drove away with another quiet explanation, I would follow him from the moment he left our driveway until I finally discovered the story he had spent nearly a year protecting. The opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. On Tuesday morning, Michael finished his breakfast, glanced at his watch, and mentioned that he needed to deliver a few documents before stopping by the hardware store. His explanation sounded casual, almost rehearsed, and I simply smiled while pouring another cup of coffee. 10 minutes after he backed out of the driveway, I picked up my purse, waited another minute to avoid attracting attention, and followed the same route from a comfortable distance. The traffic was light, making it easier to keep his blue sedan in sight without feeling obvious. As before, he turned into the quiet neighborhood with the neatly trimmed lawns and tree-lined sidewalks. My heartbeat quickened, but I reminded myself that I had come this far to learn the truth, not to let fear decide what happened next. Michael parked in front of the familiar White House and carried 2 reusable grocery bags to the porch. The woman greeted him with the same gentle smile I had seen before, but this time the front door remained open long enough for me to notice framed family photographs hanging in the hallway. Before either of them disappeared inside, another woman stepped out from a neighboring house and waved cheerfully toward Michael. She crossed the lawn holding a small casserole dish covered with foil. I rolled my window down just enough to hear her voice. "Morning, Michael. How is your sister feeling today?" she asked warmly. Michael answered with a tired smile. "Some days are better than others. Thank you for bringing dinner again. Evelyn really appreciates your kindness." Sister. The single word settled over me so suddenly that I almost forgot to breathe. Evelyn. I had never heard that name before. The neighbor wished them both well before returning home, leaving me frozen behind the steering wheel. My mind raced through decades of family stories, old photographs, holiday gatherings, and conversations with Michael's late parents. He had always told me he was an only child. There had never been any mention of a sister. Not once. I remained where I was for several minutes, trying to make sense of what I had heard. Eventually Michael came back outside alone carrying an empty cardboard box. He placed it in the trunk of his car and drove away toward the hardware store exactly as he had claimed earlier that morning. I did not follow him this time. Instead, I stayed parked across the street, staring at the quiet house while questions crowded every corner of my mind. Had Michael lied about his family before we were even married? Or was there another explanation hidden somewhere beneath that impossible conversation? As I debated whether to leave, the front door opened again. The woman stepped onto the porch with the golden retriever walking beside her. She moved slowly, pausing to catch her breath before sitting in a wooden rocking chair. Even from across the street I could see that she looked tired, though her expression remained peaceful. She opened a small photo album and smiled softly at one of the pictures before gently wiping away a tear. There was no sign of secrecy, triumph, or deception, only quiet sadness. I drove home more confused than ever. I had begun this journey believing I would uncover a simple betrayal, something painful but familiar. Instead, I had discovered a mystery that reached much deeper than broken promises. If Evelyn truly was Michael's sister, then the greatest deception in our marriage was not about where he spent his afternoons. It was about a part of his life he had somehow hidden from me for more than 4 decades, and I knew I could not rest until I understood why. That evening I could barely focus on the book resting in my lap. I turned the same page 3 times without reading a single sentence. Michael sat across the living room watching the evening news as though nothing in our lives had changed. Every now and then he glanced toward me with the familiar smile that had once brought me comfort. Now I found myself wondering how many years that smile had been carrying a secret I had never suspected. I was not angry anymore. Confusion had replaced anger. And confusion can be far heavier because it leaves no clear direction. The following morning after Michael left the house, I climbed into the attic looking for old family albums. Dust floated through the narrow beam of sunlight coming from the small window near the roof. We had stored dozens of boxes there after retiring, each one filled with photographs, greeting cards, and memories collected over 4 decades together. If Michael truly had a sister, I believed there had to be some trace of her somewhere in all those forgotten years. I opened album after album. There were photographs from our wedding, Christmas mornings, camping trips, birthdays, graduations, and family reunions. Michael appeared beside his parents in nearly every picture, smiling with the quiet confidence I had always admired. Yet he was always alone. No sister. No mysterious young girl standing beside him. I almost gave up until I reached a faded envelope tucked inside the back cover of an old scrapbook. Several loose photographs slipped into my lap. One picture immediately caught my attention. It showed a teenage Michael standing beside a young girl who looked remarkably like the woman from the White House. They shared the same eyes, the same gentle smile, and the same dark hair before time had turned it silver. On the back of the photograph, written in elegant handwriting, were the words, "Michael and Evelyn. Summer of 1974. I stared at those words for several minutes. The date was 2 years before Michael and I first met. He had never mentioned Evelyn during our engagement, our marriage, or any conversation afterward. I searched the envelope again and found a newspaper clipping folded into quarters. Time had turned the paper yellow, making the print difficult to read, but one sentence remained perfectly clear. It described a serious automobile accident involving the Carter family. The article explained that Michael had survived with minor injuries, while another family member required extensive long-term medical treatment. The remainder of the article had been damaged by age, leaving several lines unreadable. My hands trembled as I carefully placed everything back into the envelope. Suddenly many pieces began fitting together. The monthly payments, the medical supply company, the grocery bags, the quiet visits. None of it looked like the hidden romance I had imagined. It looked like responsibility. It looked like guilt. But if that was true, why had he hidden Evelyn from me for 43 years? Why carry such a burden alone instead of trusting the person who had promised to stand beside him through every season of life? That afternoon Michael called to say he would be home later than expected because someone needed his help. His voice sounded tired, almost fragile. And for the first time I noticed something I had overlooked for months. Beneath every carefully chosen explanation was a sadness that no ordinary errand could explain. I ended the call gently and looked once more at the old photograph resting on the kitchen table. The smiling young woman beside my husband had quietly stepped into my life without ever meeting me, and I knew that before another day passed, I would have to discover the story hidden behind that faded picture, even if it changed everything I believed about the man I had loved for most of my life. I did not wait for another coincidence to answer my questions. The next afternoon, after Michael left the house with the familiar promise that he would only be gone for a couple of hours, I drove to the quiet neighborhood once more. This time I did not park across the street. I walked slowly up the sidewalk, my heart beating harder with every step until I reached the blue front door. For a brief moment I considered turning around. Then I remembered the anniversary dinner, the empty chair across from me, and the promises that had slowly unraveled into silence. I rang the doorbell. A few seconds later the door opened, and the woman I had watched from a distance stood before me. She looked surprised but not frightened. Her eyes rested on my face for a long moment before she offered a gentle smile. "You must be Helen," she said quietly. Hearing my name from a complete stranger stopped me cold. I managed a small nod. "And you are Evelyn?" She smiled sadly. "Yes. Please come in." Her calmness unsettled me more than any angry denial could have. The living room was warm and modest, decorated with family photographs, handmade quilts, and shelves filled with books that had clearly been read many times. There were framed pictures of children I did not recognize, landscapes from national parks, and one old photograph of a young Michael standing beside Evelyn decades earlier. She noticed my eyes lingering on the picture. "He kept that one," she said softly. "I thought he had thrown it away years ago." We sat across from each other with untouched cups of tea resting between us. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally I asked the question that had followed me for days. Why did my husband tell me he was an only child? Evelyn lowered her eyes toward her hands. They trembled slightly before she answered. "Because he believed it was the only way to protect everyone." I frowned, unable to understand. She took a slow breath before continuing. "When we were young, our family went through something that changed all of our lives. After the accident, I needed years of medical care. My parents struggled financially, and Michael blamed himself every single day even though no one blamed him. He decided that when he built a family of his own, he would leave that painful chapter behind. He thought if people knew about me, they would only see obligation instead of hope. I listened without interrupting. Every word answered one question while creating another. Then why continue hiding the truth after all these years? I asked gently. Tears gathered in Evelyn's eyes. Because once a secret survives long enough, it becomes harder to tell than to keep. Every year he wanted to explain. Every year he became more afraid that you would wonder why he had waited so long. Before I could respond, the front door opened. Michael stepped inside carrying another grocery bag. The color drained from his face the instant he saw me sitting across from Evelyn. He quietly placed the bag on the kitchen counter and stood completely still. The room filled with a silence that carried the weight of 4 decades. He looked at me with tired eyes and whispered, "Helen, I never wanted you to discover it this way." I met his gaze without anger, without raising my voice, and without looking away. "Then tell me the way you should have done it 43 years ago." For the first time since our anniversary, Michael slowly sat down, folded his hands together, and prepared to tell me the story he had buried for almost his entire adult life. Michael remained silent for several seconds, staring at his folded hands before finally lifting his eyes to meet mine. His voice was steady, but every word seemed to carry years of regret. He told me that the accident had happened during a family trip when he was only 18. A moment of distraction behind the wheel had changed everything. He escaped with only minor injuries, but Evelyn spent months in the hospital followed by years of rehabilitation. Although the police ruled the accident unavoidable because of dangerous road conditions, Michael never forgave himself. Their parents spent nearly every dollar they had caring for Evelyn, and Michael worked multiple jobs while attending college to help support them. When we met a few years later, he wanted to leave those painful memories behind. He convinced himself that telling me about Evelyn would only bring old sorrow into the new life we were building together. 1 year became 5. 5 became 10. Then the silence became permanent because every passing anniversary made the truth more difficult to explain. After their parents passed away, Michael quietly promised Evelyn that he would never abandon her. He helped pay for her medical needs, repaired her home whenever something broke, and visited every week so she would never feel alone. Evelyn interrupted softly and told me she had begged him many times to tell me everything. She said she never wanted to become the invisible person standing between a husband and his wife. Michael admitted that every time he planned to tell me, fear stopped him. He feared that I would believe he had lied because he no longer trusted me, when the truth was that he no longer trusted himself to explain decades of silence. Then he looked directly at me, and for the first time in many years I saw tears gathering in his eyes. He apologized for missing our anniversary dinner. Evelyn had experienced a medical emergency that afternoon. It was not life-threatening, but she had become frightened after feeling unwell, and he rushed to her house without thinking about anything else. He admitted that he should have called me immediately instead of allowing me to wait alone at the restaurant. That decision, he said, was entirely his responsibility. I listened without interrupting. Every answer softened one wound while exposing another. I understood why he wanted to help his sister. I understood loyalty. I understood family. What I could not easily understand was 43 years of believing I was protecting a marriage built on complete honesty, while an entire chapter of his life had remained locked away. I stood and slowly walked toward the window overlooking Evelyn's quiet front yard. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the grass while the golden retriever slept peacefully beneath the maple tree. Nothing about the scene felt dramatic anymore. Simply felt human. Behind me, Michael quietly said that if I decided I could no longer trust him, he would accept whatever choice I made. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not offer excuses beyond the truth he had finally shared. I turned back toward both of them and realized that the greatest damage had not been caused by one terrible decision decades ago. It had been caused by thousands of ordinary days when fear spoke louder than honesty. In that moment I understood that deciding whether our marriage could survive would not depend on the secret itself. It would depend on whether two people in their 60s still had enough courage to begin telling each other the complete truth, even after 43 years of silence. When Michael and I drove home that evening, neither of us spoke very much. The silence between us felt different from the silence that had haunted our house during the previous weeks. That silence had been built on unanswered questions. This one was built on difficult truths that still needed time to settle into our hearts. The following morning I woke to the familiar smell of fresh coffee. Michael was already in the kitchen, standing exactly where he had stood thousands of mornings before. The only difference was that when I walked into the room, he looked directly at me instead of looking away. He placed a small wooden box on the table. "There is nothing else I am hiding," he said quietly. Inside the box were old photographs, letters, hospital records, and journals he had kept over the years. There were birthday cards Evelyn had written to him, receipts for repairs he had made to her home, and handwritten notes from their parents thanking him for never giving up on his sister. He told me I could read every page if I wished because he no longer wanted fear to decide what belonged inside our marriage. I spent the next several hours reading through the memories he had guarded for so long. Some pages brought tears to my eyes. Others made me smile at the kindness he had quietly shown without expecting recognition. More than once I stopped reading simply to reflect on how two different truths could exist at the same time. Michael had been a devoted brother. He had also been a husband who allowed silence to replace honesty. Both things were true, and accepting one did not erase the other. A few days later I asked him to take me back to Evelyn's house. This time I walked through the blue front door not as a stranger searching for answers, but as someone ready to meet the woman whose life had been connected to mine without either of us realizing it. We spent the afternoon looking through old family photographs together. Evelyn laughed as she shared stories from childhood that Michael had never told me. She apologized once again for the years of secrecy, but I gently reached across the table and held her hand. The burden had never belonged to her alone. It had belonged to all of us the moment fear became stronger than trust. Before we left, Evelyn smiled and asked if we would come back the following Sunday for dinner. I looked at Michael before answering. He smiled nervously, almost like the young man I had married decades earlier. "Only if we bring dessert," I replied. On our next anniversary, we returned to the same restaurant overlooking the river. We ordered the lemon cake we had missed the year before, and watched the sunset reflect across the water. Michael reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. It was not expensive jewelry or an elaborate gift. It was a letter. In it he promised that from that day forward there would be no more hidden chapters, no matter how painful they might be. I believed him, not because promises can erase the past, but because honesty had finally replaced the silence that nearly cost us everything. Looking back now, I have learned that love is not destroyed by every mistake. Sometimes it is weakened by the stories we are too afraid to tell. Trust is not rebuilt in one conversation or one apology. It returns slowly through ordinary mornings, truthful words, shared burdens, and the quiet choice to face life together without hiding behind yesterday. Our marriage did not become perfect after that season. No marriage ever does. But it became real again, and after 43 years together, I discovered that the strongest anniversaries are not the ones where everything goes exactly as planned. They are the ones where two imperfect people finally choose truth over fear and walk into the future with nothing left to hide.